it's hard for us to appreciate how important it is to come together at times like this, to bring our energy together, to be in the company of other like-minded souls. Most of you, I mean, I have the privilege of living in spiritual community, and I have for a very long time, where I'm surrounded by people who share my thoughts and my aspirations in life. We're a motley crew. Yesterday afternoon, I was with a lot of the core teachers and people of this group, and you're a motley crew also. It's the more we become centered in ourselves, the more we become originals. Originals not in the sense necessarily that we're outside the mainstream or doing something that nobody's done, but the actual meaning of the word original is your point of origin. And so much of people's lives is just an imitation of what's being said around them. I was always very independent in my way of thinking. It's just, as I was saying to some of you last night, I was just born that way. At the age of 15, I decided that high heels were the stupidest invention in the world, and I've never put on another pair after that. It's just like, why would anyone walk around like that, doing that to their back? And at 15, I also figured out that fashion was entirely a question of whether you were embarrassed or not. And if you weren't embarrassed, there was absolutely no enforcement method at all. But just sort of, that was my way of thinking. But in much more serious ways, this was just adolescence trying to express itself. I was working when I was, just before I was 20, or maybe when I was 20, I was working in a law office, actually. I had no education because I dropped out of college, and I had no interest in having a career, but I was clever, so I got myself into this secretarial position. I was terrible at it, I would add. Really, really terrible. I was so terrible I didn't even know until much later how terrible I was. And one of the jobs that I had, it was in a legal office. It was very, very, this was so long ago. This was just before there were computers. There were barely electric typewriters, but we did have running water. It wasn't, it wasn't that long ago. But so I ran some sort of a machine, which was the beginning of being able to do things in an automated way. And I worked there for 3 months, and at the end of 3 months, that was my probation. I thought she would give me a raise, and she fired me. And she fired me because I didn't give a damn. And she was intuitive enough to realize that I didn't, that I just had no commitment to it. And even more than that, totally puzzled me that anybody would care. Just like, because it had no meaning to me. Of course, I was extremely immature, and I didn't understand other people's realities at all. I was the absolute definition of immaturity. My way is the only way that there is. But it served me eventually to get me to something I cared about. 10 years after that, when I was actually in charge of publications at Ananda Village, I ran the publications business, and I had the phrase, into the ground, because that's actually what I did. I was horrible at it. When Swami finally fired me after about 1.5 years or 2 years, I knew he fired me for absolute gross incompetence, but I was so happy to be relieved of this job that I actually said to him, he fired me on a Friday. And I said, I know you have some things you have to say to me, but don't say them yet. On Monday, you can tell me, because I just want to be happy over the weekend. I don't have to do this horrible job anymore. So he agreed. And I celebrated for 2 days. Then on Monday, he told me what a dunce I'd been, and then I had to live with that for a while. Why am I saying this? Oh, yes. So when I'm suddenly in charge of people, I realized why that woman fired me. And I wrote her. I wrote her and said, oh, thank you. I'm so glad you fired me. I finally understand. I have people working for me who don't give a damn, and they're horrible. I mean, even in the context of Ananda, they didn't care about the job they were doing. There's just like this whole process of growing up is a really big deal. When I came to Ananda, I moved into the community when I was, just before I was 24. And I met Swamiji just past the age of 22. 22 and a half is when I met Swami. And I often say to people, I grew up at Ananda Village. And there are people who did grow up at Ananda Village who were born there and that was their whole life. But when I say that, people try to do the math and it just, it doesn't come out right, that I could have actually been born there. But it was basically, that's when I began to learn really how to be a really God-inspired human being, which is really what the point of all our lives is. In his book, Education for Life, a very interesting fact about Paramahansa Yogananda is when he finished his 10 years of training with his guru, Sri Yukteswar, and he went out at his guru's instruction to try to make something happen that would be an expression of all that he'd been given, he started a school for children. And it wasn't as if Yogananda himself needed time to mature. He was ready. He was a God-realized master. He had everything was complete in his life. But the first thing he did was start to educate children. And at one point I found a few other books written by various people. There's a few other books written about Yogananda by people who knew him in India. And when I was reading that, it wasn't merely that he started a school. He was totally involved in the school. He spent a lot of his time it was a boys' school because they were divided in those days, but he spent a lot of time with the boys. He was himself a young man, and he was 27, I think, when he came to the United States. So he was still a young man himself, and he was there with those boys, which is just interesting that an avatar would dedicate himself like that. And when he bought Mount Washington in Los Angeles, 1925, the first thing he started there was a school for children. And he only converted it into that monastery when the school just failed. And the school failed because nobody understood why they should give their children to this weird Swami from India. He realized he had to convert the parents before he would be able to get the children. Many years later, 30 years ago now, we started a school in Palo Alto, which is the community, the Ananda community that I helped found and that I live in. And we had an extremely gifted teacher, I mean a real genius of a teacher of small children, young children. Well, she could teach anybody. And she wanted to dedicate her life to Yogananda's ideals. And so with her as the very charismatic center, we started the school. But I had to persuade parents. Parents are protective of their children. They have this kind of sense of responsibility. So when you say, would you give your child to a school that doesn't exist unless you give your child to it? There was a certain hesitation, that I felt. What really saved us was we'd introduce their children to that teacher, and they would just go home and say, Mommy, can I go to school with her? So we were able to get it started. But all of this is, Swami Kriyananda, in his way, took on the issue of educating children, because if you really want to change society, you have to start with young people. That's what will really change society. You have to raise them up different. I could go on and on and on about this, but I'll try not to. It'll take a lot of self-restraint. I have a lot to say about this. But the point is, Swami Kriyananda wrote, this is what I was getting to, true maturity is the ability to relate to realities other than your own. To actually to relate to realities other than your own. To really realize that everyone is not just like me. Of course, in the cosmic sense we are, but this is what I was saying also last night. Everyone has their own story, their own unique story. And the most marvelous thing to me is everybody makes sense to themselves. And they do. They all make sense to themselves, otherwise you wouldn't do it. I've always, I like to sew, or my mother sent me out to learn to sew. My mother never learned to sew, so she sent both her daughters to learn. My sewing teacher's name was Mrs. Taylor. Can you believe that? Even as a child, I really appreciated the irony of that. So Mrs. Taylor taught me to sew, and I've always liked fabric. I don't like fashion, but I like fabric and I like clothes. And I do costumes for our school play and things like that. So I'm always conscious of what people are wearing. And sometimes I see people and I think, you're an adult, you dressed yourself, you put yourself in that this morning. And I really, seriously, I try to think, what kind of a consciousness would put on that costume like that and look at themselves and think, this is who I want to be. And sometimes you see people with a certain kind of posture or way of walking, or I saw this man chewing gum with a kind of enthusiasm that seemed bigger than gum. And I just tried to tune in, like, what's motivating him to chew gum like that? I mean, this is like I'm on my bicycle going back to my house. He's coming out of his house, getting into his car, chewing gum like this. But it's very instructive to sort of look outside yourself, and then you actually look at yourself. And you say, what am I trying to accomplish? Who am I really? And is this really who I want to be? Because every little thing that we do, this is an energy universe. Energy doesn't go away. It just keeps shifting form. Just keeps shifting form all the way through, but it doesn't disappear. And we, because we are egoically identified with our individuality, even though our true nature is infinite, we have taken our infinite consciousness and condensed it down like the small point of a big funnel. Our consciousness actually goes out to infinity, like the top of the funnel, but we live down in that little tiny part that you stick into the jar so you can pour something in. And that's where we live, and we're identified with that individuality, so everything that we do stays with us. Every thought, every feeling, every action is a particular state of consciousness, and it registers in the chakras. The whole system of metaphysics of how it works and how karma works is all an understanding of the chakras. And I know everybody these days knows what that word means and knows what we're talking about. But a real sophisticated understanding of the chakras really helps, because then we begin to make sense to ourselves. We know that everything that I am now is the buildup of all the decisions I made yesterday. When I was, just before I turned 19, when I was handed Swami Vivekananda's book, Vivekananda being the most well-known disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, an avatar of the late 1800s in India. Ramakrishna was what's called your Upa-Guru, which is a phrase that is really wonderful. It means a true guru who takes care of you until you come to your final point. So Ramakrishna came into my life first, and then I met Swami, which brought me to Yogananda. But my relationship with Ramakrishna was true. And so all of that. So let's see now, in that book, oh yes, it was about karma. In that book, Vivekananda said 3 things that completely changed my life and are still the watchwords of my life. First was, perfect love casts out all fear, which I thought was original with him. Turns out St. John said it a long time ago before him. I didn't know that for a long time, because I was raised Jewish, so I didn't know the New Testament. Perfect love casts out all fear. Who you are today is the result of what you did yesterday. Who you will be tomorrow is the result of what you do today. It was the first, what I would say, absolute truth that I'd ever heard. And it was the first time somebody gave me a clue as to how to make my life what I wanted it to be. I was so intent on learning how to make my life what I wanted it to be, but nobody was really telling me that. And it was so frustrating to me. They were telling me, memorize the history test, write this essay, get into a good university, just things that are not useless, but we're not on point. Vivekananda told me, on point. You're creating your own reality. I didn't know the chakras, I didn't know reincarnation, I didn't know karma, but that's what he said. And then the last thing he said was, don't think about yourself and you'll be happy. I was 18, almost 19, and I thought, what else do you think about? I wasn't selfish. I've always had a generous nature. It's my good karma. But I always knew where I stood in any situation, mostly because I was always looking to see if I could extract more fun out of a situation. So I wanted to know where I was standing and see if I could make it a little better. But it was the first time that it occurred to me that the little tiny bit at the end of the funnel was not the whole story. And these are such simple ideas, but they're challenging to change because of the chakras. Because the word chakra itself means wheel. And the energy in the chakras, in each chakra, the word is vritti. Vritti means whirlpool. There's some center point, some centered decision, and then because of your commitment to that centered decision, everything else, you make lots of other decisions that all add energy to that and that central point. And it can be a fear or a desire or an ambition. And it's not bad, because if you set your mind to do something, then this is what you're going to do. You build up a whirlpool of energy that's going where you want it to go. But in the course of all of our incarnations, we develop these fixed commitments. And then everything else comes after that, even where we choose to incarnate. We choose to incarnate because there's a fixed point in one of our chakras, and there's a whirlpool of energy. And if you think about a river trying to get to the sea, as soon as the water comes out of the earth, it has this mission to try to get to the ocean. And it just keeps trying to get to the ocean, and it will get to the ocean eventually. That's us. We're manifested from the divine, and we have this destiny and this absolute, it's also a desire. We want perfect satisfaction, perfect fulfillment. We know we were made for bliss. It's very interesting. Think about that for a minute. If we knew that the only option in life was to suffer, when we suffer, we would just be living life. But whenever we suffer, a huge part of us knows that there's something wrong with this. Why do we know that? And why are we so convinced? It's because inside of all of us is this divine aspect. That's who we are. And that aspect is desperately trying to get to the ocean of bliss. However, if you think about a flowing river, when I lived at Ananda village up in the mountains I was there for 16 years, my childhood, my spiritual childhood, and the Yuba River is near there, and my life didn't allow me to go running to the river every hot afternoon, but I spent enough time there. And you would see the river, and it would be heading for the sea, just with this incredible determination. Where does it come from? How do it know? And nonetheless, it's heading for the sea. But there would be complications. There would be rocks, there would be a tree, there would be somebody who pushed an old truck into the river, And as a consequence, a great deal of the river would start whirling around some stuck central point. And one way to unstuck it, of course, is you go in and you haul the old truck out and you liberate the whirlpool, which is what we do when we try to introspect. We try to understand, why am I holding on to this idea? Do I need to hold on to it? Where did it come from? We try to dismantle the whirlpool. And the other way that the whirlpools are dismantled is that the flow of the river gets so strong that it overcomes the whirlpool. Some years when I've driven back up to the mountains there, when there's been a lot of rain, and we go across the bridge, going across that river, and, the river's almost up to the top of the bridge. And there aren't going to be a lot of whirlpools who stood against that furious flow. And inside ourselves, when we the way the energy circulates, it circulates in an up and down pattern. This is related to the Kundalini energy. This is related to the in and outflow of breath. These are all metaphysical things that many of you have studied or can study easily here with Isha Das and the other teachers here. But what we're doing when we're doing Kriya practice or other kinds of a serious meditation is we're increasing the flow of that energy. And the stronger that energy gets, this is why people say, don't worry about anything, just meditate. Because if you meditate in such a way that you actually are cooperating with these subtle metaphysical laws, which is why Yogananda writes about Kriya Yoga the way he does, that it can really change your destiny. It's not, Master did not create Kriya Yoga, it's the way we're made. You know, a doctor doesn't create the way the blood flows in the body, he just learns about it and then figures out how to work with it. So Kriya is just working with that which is, but in a way that we can all access. So we increase that flow, and then any whirlpool, which is karma, that's what our karma is all those little vrittis. And it's like somehow those vrittis have to be released. So we release them either by understanding them and transcending it. We release it by having those vrittis dominate our consciousness and draw us into experiences. You know, maybe we've spent many incarnations wanting to marry so-and-so never marries us. You know, he marries our sister. Isn't that annoying? You know, all kinds of things happen like that. And finally we get our chance to marry so-and-so, and we get to live out that vritti, and it either makes us stronger in our determination, or we learn, and we don't have our lives be run anymore by that. We let it go. We stop adding energy to it. I saw a picture of this movie star, and she had such a physical body, and it was a picture, it still stays in my mind, so much magnetism for being a beautiful female movie star. My first thought was, my word, how many incarnations have you been working on this? You know, really, because everything about her was, I don't even know her name, it was just a photo, but it really impressed me. How did you get the right parents, you know, to give you that body and then cultivate it? And you know, it's a vritti that's just been absorbing all the energy of the river for all this time until it's been taken away. You know, so this is what we're always working with. We're always building energy according to every thought, action, and feeling, which is based on what is most important to us. I mean, this is all that Vivekananda said to me in his book. Who you are today is the result of yesterday. Who you'll be tomorrow is the result of today. On the other side of that is, wow, isn't that great news? You know, even if I'm still being compelled by energies that I no longer remember, there's no, you know, and I'm not an expert on this, and I have great respect for this, so I'm not denigrating this. You know, we have these traumas that we're living with, all these things that we're afraid of. I have a great sensitivity to music, and actually I've learned I have a very good ear, but I have a very difficult time really singing. I can sing sometimes, and I have come to know from past life understanding that I used to be really good at this, and I did some really awful things, you know, as a prima donna. And so, and actually, I even remember when I was younger, the only thing I was really interested in was theater. And you know, in school, and then a little bit after, I played the actress. I was pretty good at it, and I was really interested. But I always knew I could never pursue that life because I couldn't sing. And of course, I could have been an actress without being a singer. But when I began to learn about past lives and all of that, I realized I was being protected because it hadn't worked out really well for me before. You know, so you have, and I'm just giving you that as a very concrete example because all of us have a story. So one of the most fundamental things for us to understand is nowhere in your chakras are the things that bother you. You know, the past life when you were so-and-so, when I was the diva and misused that position, all those different things. It doesn't still exist inside of me. That person isn't there anymore. The people that I hurt or the people that hurt me, they're not there anymore. The illness that I died of, the suicide that I did, the murders that I committed, I mean, there's nothing in there. It's just an energy pattern. So the fixity of that energy pattern is real, but it's nothing but energy. Which is to say, energy is influenced by other energy. And so whatever pattern is there, we create an alternate energy to it. And that's what meditation does. And it gradually, let me just think how to say this exactly. That you convert it. You convert the energy. You just convert it from leaning this way to leaning that way. Literally, and that's why the river is so good. When the river is flowing strong enough, the whirlpool disappears. Because the whirlpool never had any existence. It was just a pattern of energy. And the same energy becomes part of who you are now. Which is why, really often on the spiritual path, we just change so radically. There was, I went on a trip with Swami to New York City in the mid-'70s. And we were hosted by this couple who lived in New York. And that a couple of years before, they had come out to California, that couple, and stayed for a few weeks at our community. I was running the kitchen at that time, and they volunteered with me in the kitchen. And since that time, I wore glasses, I'd changed my glasses, maybe I even had contact lenses, I'd cut my hair, a few things like that. So we get there, and Swamiji introduces me to them, and I said, oh no, we met last summer when you were at the village. They said, we've never met you before. I said, well, you worked in the kitchen, and I was there. Oh, no, that was someone else, they said. They said it about 3 times, and I kept insisting it had been me, and then I thought, why don't you just accept it? You know, if they don't recognize you, then let's affirm that I'm unrecognizable, because I've changed so much. And that was the first time it occurred to me how radical this revolution could be. But you see, here was the part that was so interesting. I felt more like myself rather than less. You know, and this is where I was starting, where we absorb the thoughts and feelings around us. In one of those, not the one where I got fired, but another office I worked, there was this, I was 20, and there was this girl in there who was getting married. And it was so interesting to me because she was getting married completely out of magazines. And I had this feeling that she had picked her husband out of the magazine too. And I'm almost certain that she got divorced out of the magazine. And I had never seen anyone in my short life who allowed themselves to be dictated to entirely from the outside. And whose entire focus was, my family wasn't like that. It was just looking outside themselves. Now, it's easy for us to talk about it if we're talking about fashion. I'm going to talk, there's a lot of women in this room, and I'll talk about this. One of the most amazing things to me about fashion is so much of it is ugly, but we don't know that. Or we resist that thought. And I specifically remember when big black shoes for women with big heavy soles came in. And now I know people still wear them. I don't mean to be rude. But anyway, big black shoes came in, and they were ugly. And at first I knew. And then one day I was in a department store, and I picked up a pair of big black shoes with a black sole, and I said, these are cute, let me try them on. And I thought, oh my God, you know, I used to know that these are not attractive. How do I not know that anymore? And it's trivial, but sometimes the trivial illustrates it. You see? In the Bhagavad Gita it says, what is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. And what is night to the worldly man is day to the yogi. And I mean, that's a pretty dramatic statement, which just says you have to flip the whole thing over. And we're constantly becoming afraid and confused because we're just believing the story that's told around us. This is what Maya is. And it has a tremendous power. And for us to really be on the spiritual path, we have to constantly asking, why do I believe this? Like, why do I believe this? I mean, let's start with the fact that we die, and that we're supposed to be afraid to die. And we're supposed to hold on to where we are. I'm always a little confused. And again, I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings here, but this is just like interest to me. My father, at the last 2 years of his life, his mind was not working in the way it had worked. Actually, it was wonderful, because he'd always been very Virgo. He was like a Virgo's Virgo. And he was always very detailed-minded about everything, which often caused him to be a little worried about things. In the last few years of his life, he forgot what he was worried about. And he was just so sweet and so happy. He'd always been lovely. I had a very nice father. But he was particularly nice at the end. He's in this facility in Southern California. I'm in Northern California. They call me up, and they start, the staff calls me and says, "We called poison control and there's no problem." I said, "Well, that's an odd introduction. What are we talking about?" Okay, so my dad, they served their meals family style, and my father ate half the flower arrangement because it was on the table, like everything else. And they called poison control, and they found out that, it was fine. Poison control. I didn't know there was such a thing, but now I know, like that. But I just started laughing, and then they started laughing because they thought it was funny too, because no harm had been done. But it was very interesting to me because it was on the table with everything else in a plate, and most people could tell the difference between the potatoes and the flowers, but he couldn't tell the difference anymore because everything was the same to him. I mean, that's to a very large extent how a saint lives, isn't it? Just everything is the same to them because they see the same divine light. And when they look at others, Swami Kriyananda talked about one night when he was in a hotel room in Florence. It doesn't matter where he was, but he just had this very vivid dream. I'm sure it was more like a superconscious vision, but he called it a dream. And he said in it he was able to see that every single human being aspires for the same thing. And what really defines us is not the little ways that we express things, but what we're reaching for. In another context, Swamiji said, if you're ever going to judge yourself, and then parenthetically said, which I don't recommend doing, he said, whatever you may be right now, by definition, because life is a flow of energy, by the time you're looking at it, you're already past it. Because it's not a fixed universe. So what you are now is already behind you. Took you a long time to get here, and now you're done with it. He said, who you actually are is what you aspire to become. And it doesn't even mean how effectively you're going there. It just means that deep within yourself, that's where you're going. And that defines who you are. So I was asked last night what to do about the oscillations of sometimes I'm meditating and sometimes I'm not, or sometimes I'm God-inspired and sometimes I'm not. Well, that's what it is. But if you know where you're going, and what Swamiji was saying with that is that you don't even have to consciously know where you're going. But we are a drop of water in the river, and we are determined to get to the sea. And Swami said he was overwhelmed with love for everyone when he just realized how we're all just the same. And this is what makes it possible for people of greater spiritual understanding to just have such a loving, calm, and easy attitude about everything. Because what is there to worry about? Sooner or later, Swamiji even also remarked that when he sees, this is a very important point, he said, when he sees people suffering, and of course in this world we see a lot of people suffering, we may see more. When he sees people suffering, he thinks, oh, then how much greater will be their joy when they finally realize God. That the contrast with the present suffering compared to the joy of God realization, how much greater will be that joy? And then we come to issues like, how real is time? What does it matter? Very early I learned an interesting lesson about Swamiji's attitude toward time, which has actually helped me. I worked as Swami's secretary, is what he called me. The word personal assistant is more the word, but that didn't exist in the early 70s. Swami himself was not tidy in his own house. And one of Master's rules, his guru's rules for a good life was when you finish working with something, put it away. Swami says that takes too much time. So he was quite he was never confused. He knew where everything was in his house, but it would be lying around in lots of different ways. It wasn't a disorder in his mind. But when I began to work for him, I thought we should tidy it up. So I started tidying things up. And at the end of his life, his house was always impeccable, and so people thought that was his lifestyle, but it wasn't. It was the result of good staff. But in any case, so I started all of that. And at one time, the dome that he lived in, now the house has been changed, but he had a sleeping loft, and then he had a partition, then there was the office and the living, but it was really just one dome. And he'd gone up to take a nap in the sleeping loft, and I was doing things, and I was in the office, and there was a brass cup there that had kumkum powder, red powder, and Swami gave Kriya initiation twice a year, every 6 months. And he would hold that cup in his hand, and he would tip his finger in it so that when he touched you at the spiritual eye, it left a red mark, so that you were blessed. You could really see it. This is an Indian tradition, of course. So I see that cup, and I know how often he uses it. So I'm going to take the cup down. I'm going to put the powder in a jar. I'm going to close the jar. I'm going to put a label on the jar. I'm going to wash the cup. I'm going to put the cup away. I'm going to seal it away. And he, both intuitively and perhaps audibly, maybe he heard me, he said, "Don't touch that, I'm using it." And I knew for a fact that he used it for about 4 hours, 2 times a year. But in his mind, my sense of time was today is different from tomorrow, and tomorrow is different than the day after, and yesterday is not today. I'd just taken the flow of the river to the ocean, and I'd broken it up into all these little compartments that I could control. That I could make them be. I was going to put it in a jar, and I was going to put a lid on it, and I was going to put a label. Then I would be master of the kumkum powder. Just, it would give me some sense of, seriously. I mean, that's really what I was doing. To Swamiji, he was using it. He was using it. It was part of the active expression of his life. And why don't we think like that? Because we've just absorbed all of this. So coming to this, a woman friend of mine who was not speaking accurately about herself, but she commented because she didn't paint or dance or write at that time or anything. She said, "I'm not very creative," she said. I said, "My dear, even to be on the spiritual path, you have to be tremendously creative. You have to have a tremendous imagination, because you have to look at this world and see that it is not what it seems. Some part of you has to be able to just take the whole story and say what is day to the worldly man is night to the yogi. And that doesn't mean we're at war with ourselves or think this world is horrible. It's that we're just not going to buy the story. And we're not going to allow ourselves to be subtly influenced by it. And this is why I was saying, so it's very important to come here, because this is your local place, or to a place like this, but unfortunately there are not that many places like this, or like Ananda, if for no other reason, just to sit in the room where other people are vibrating like you're vibrating. Even though I'm not a very good singer, I can actually sing in the choir, especially if certain really good singers are right there. Because when I hear it, I know what to do. If I'm standing by myself, I'm just completely at sea. But as soon as they start doing it, I can match it. But that's what we're trying to do, spiritually speaking. And this is why we have all the pictures of the masters in this absolutely wonderful I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Here, we think that the masters and God only love us sometimes, only guide us sometimes, because we only are able to hear and feel and receive that guidance sometimes. So we think that they keep certain hours and turn it on and off. God is out. God is in. That is not true, because it's the word unconditional. Unconditional love and guidance from Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, your guardian angel. They don't sleep. They don't need to sleep. And they have only one reality, and that reality is to emanate the light, and we are being showered with it at all times. I often refer to these near-death experiences because they're so magnificent for just breaking the illusion. Person comes out of their body, and they're still there, and invariably, although some of them do go to darker regions, but we don't really see those as much. But they just say, it's so different than I thought. And what they always talk about is how constant the shower of divine love is. So we think that God is intermittent in his guidance and in his affection, but it's rather we who are intermittent in our will and our ability to receive it. And you see how that it would change everything if we always knew that? And if you can even just first know it just as a theory, as a possibility, that it might be true, and conduct the right experiment, and resist, the thoughts that are all around us. You have to be afraid. You have to be concerned about world conditions. You have to think that everybody, things that are random and God is not in charge. And death is something to fear. And pain is terrifying. I mean, these are all just, why do I believe that? I had a very difficult moment of experience in my life when people that were very close to me were suffering. It involved the hospital, as these things often do. And I was, in the role that I often play, I was kind of trying to hold things together, but I was coming to pieces. So I walked down to the car in the parking lot. I'm sure those parking lots have witnessed a lot of grief. So I was one of them, just crying my eyes out in near hysteria, because it was just way too much for me, what was happening. And right when I'm in the middle of this voice came in my right ear, and it went through my brain to make sure I heard the whole thing, and then came out my left ear. I know that sounds odd, but that's exactly how it felt. And it said, "Do you think this is happening outside the will of God?" It's very annoying when somebody speaks the truth to you when you don't want to hear it. I'm busy crying. I'm really not interested in this right now. But I was captured because I had been practicing when it was easier. This was advice that Swami gave me when I asked him a very complicated question about, in an emergency, how should I respond? What should I do? He said, what you're asking is how to know what God wants you to do. He said, in a crisis, you will just run true to pattern. You're not going to be able to create a new crisis, a new pattern in that. So you have to practice when it's easier. So I had practiced a lot when it was easier, practicing the idea that maybe God is in charge. So now when I was beyond redemption, I was so upset. That same thought came, and what could I say? Of course this is the will of God. So then I said, well, if this is your will, I have to warn you, I'm going down for the count, and if I go down, I don't know what's going to happen here, so you need to do something about this, because that's okay. You can talk like that. And that's when I came up with a prayer, which I've used ever since. Divine Mother, whatever you're trying to teach these people, you really better help them learn it, and you need to do it soon. Because I can't really help you much longer. I'm going to pieces here too. I walked back into the hospital. Crisis had ended. Everything went forward from there. Who was it happening for? Was it for the people who were suffering, or who was it for me? I mean, it was all interwoven. And now, And that happened to me decades ago. But this is my mantra I use all the time. Can this be happening outside the will of God? But I practice when it's easier. So that in principle, I've begun to see that's true. And if it's true in principle, then it has to be true everywhere, because God is not intermittent in his running of this world. He doesn't turn it over to incompetent inferiors so he can take a break. He's always in charge. So then the question follows, why do I ever worry about anything? I've certainly found that I needed to get it down to really simple ideas. Really, really simple ideas. Could this be happening outside of the will of God? And then why do I ever worry about anything? Oh, and then I have answers. Because I'm scared. Because I'm afraid something's going to be asked of me that I don't think I can do. Oh, do you think that would be happening outside the will of God? But you have to be honest. This is not something that you paste on from the outside. And this is your point of origin. You know, spirituality is not something that you can pretend. Because when the pressure comes, you'll go true to pattern. You know, they in the army, apparently at one point, they tried to figure out who would be heroes, so who had it in them to be really courageous in battle and so on, so they could set it up. They did all these psychological tests, none of which proved true. Because when it came down to it, people just were themselves, and that it wasn't a question of the facade they could put on. And you know, Jesus sets us a really good example in that respect, because Jesus, before he was crucified, said, "Let this cup pass from me." And we talk all the time about, you know, how Jesus was completely surrendered. I and my Father are one. I mean, so much is beautiful. But there at that point, he said, do we really have to do this? And it wasn't because he was afraid for himself. It was because he'd come to bring this glorious, liberating message, and their response was to crucify him. Like, this is not a good response for what I'm actually offering you. And Jesus knew his sorrow was for them, was not for himself. The sorrow of Jesus, this is a song of Swami's, sorrow of Jesus was not for himself. He mourned he grieved, that's the word. He grieved for God's love so freely given, eternally given, was rejected by mankind. That's why he wept. But he had an opinion. Let this cup pass from me. Because of course you have an opinion. You don't want people to suffer, and you don't want to suffer. But then he said, but thy will, not mine, be done. And this is the model for how you pray. You just say what you really feel, how you feel it, with everything that you feel. God knows anyway. I mean, you can't even fool your friends when you just shine on. They know what's really in your heart. So you just say it. You say it out loud. And you say it with all the strength you had. I was in a really hard situation once, and I realized who I was really mad at was these guys on the altar and Swami Kriyananda. I was furious at them. And I just gave them a good piece of my mind with language that I don't usually use. I was very, very, very upset. How dare you do this to me after all I've done for you, you know? And what was even worse, was I knew the fact that I would rise to the occasion and master the situation, and I knew that was going to be so hard. I was furious. And then after I finished, but of course you know better than I. We have to be absolutely ourselves. We have to be original. You have to go to your point of origin and be whatever it is. But you have to plant inside yourself. You have to plant inside yourself, that which will really save you. And it's a constant fight. That's why every single spiritual epic is war. But it's not really war between two sides of the army. It's the war with all of the vrittis that we have established over many incarnations that persuade us that we are justified in suffering and having a wrong attitude, and the other side of us, which says, how can this be happening outside of the will of God? And this is what I also say. I say, Divine Mother is taking me home. And if she could take me home by a more pleasant, less difficult route, she would take me that way. And so this is the fastest route home. That's what got me out of that fury that I was in with all of them. It's like, all right, but if this is the route to my freedom, that's my aspiration, and therefore that's who I am. And I don't have to like it, but you're in charge, not me. All right? Okay. Do we have any questions? Okay. No, that's very good. The question is, I'm repeating it for the recording. The question is about humility, about it helps you to see others as equals, but not be proud. But it's a complicated question. Here's a simpler way to think about it. Humility is self-honesty. Okay? And if you happen to be a brilliant singer, the best violinist in the world, a dedicated mother, and very good at being a mother, that's a fact. And humility is not to pretend that what is factual is not true, because that just puts you into untruth. Humility is just simply being what you are. But then you realize, if I'm the best violinist in the world, in 100 years, nobody's going to care. I was speaking yesterday about the book that Swami rewrote, that was published by Marie Corelli 100 years ago. She was extremely popular 100 years ago. Has any of you ever heard of her? Nobody cares anymore. So you're the best violinist on the planet. How many planets are there? And who cares? But nonetheless, you may still be the best violinist on the planet. And so that's a fact. For you to pretend that you're not and to humble yourselves in front of incompetent musicians, in the name of humility, it's not true. You know what you're doing. And every time you step outside of reality and that which is, that's how you create a mess. I mean, this whole world is a mess because we don't know that God is in charge, and we don't understand it's an energy universe, and we don't realize that if our happiness comes at the expense of other people's happiness, it won't be happiness, we'll be miserable. Those are all the untruths that we're living with, so we don't want to add one in terms of ourself. So once you understand, but humility also allows you to see the sincerity of someone else, and you can actually see what their reality is also, because you've practiced living in reality. So then the question is, what do I do about it? So the word that is really an important word that goes with humility is to be appropriate. And appropriate is a very flexible word that has to be decided in the moment. What is appropriate, and how do you measure what's appropriate? Well, I want to be helpful. And I am not more important than anybody else, but neither am I less important. And so sometimes people think humility means that I have no value and everybody else has value. But God loves us all equally. And just because this happens to be the costume that you're wearing and the body that you're in, it doesn't make it suddenly less valuable to Divine Mother than all the rest of these. So for me to hurt myself or do that which is not right for me in the name of doing what's right for you, that's not necessarily what's true. That's not reality. That's not appropriate. For me to assert myself over you at your expense is also not a very good idea. But appropriate sometimes, let me phrase it this way, to be spiritual is not always to be nice. Sometimes being nice is not actually a courageous spiritual action. Sometimes it's an act of pure cowardice. Sometimes to be appropriate is to say what you're doing is utterly unacceptable to me, and I'm packing my bag and leaving tonight, and I hope never to see you. It could be exactly the right response. Or it could be, sure, of course, anything you want, I'm happy to cooperate. Because it depends on where you and everyone else are in relation to the center. There's a story Ramakrishna told about, there was a boat ride. People would come from the city of Calcutta down to Dakshineshwar, where the Kali temple was, where he lived. And Ramakrishna was exceedingly controversial because he was really out of the box. He did not behave like anybody expected, and a lot of people thought he was crazy. And of course, time passes and everybody agrees that he was in fact an avatar. But at the time, he was very, very controversial. So one disciple is coming down to visit him on the ferry boat. And then people start, when they find out he's getting off at that temple, they start talking about this crazy man who lives there that some people are stupid enough to think is a holy man. And this particular disciple is big and strong and has a big temper. And he starts yelling at the people who are criticizing his guru, and he starts rocking the little ferry boat and tells them if they don't stop criticizing his guru, he's going to sink the ferry boat. He gets to the dock, he gets off, Ramakrishna's there, and he says, Ramakrishna starts castigating him. How foolish of you. What do you care what those people think? This business of sinking the ferry boat? What does it matter if the fools say things against me like that? Okay, next scene. Different disciple coming down on the ferry boat. They start talking about the crazy man who lives in the temple there, and he thinks, it's important for me to be peaceful at all times. So he just lets them say whatever they say. He gets off there. Ramakrishna meets him there. Ramakrishna's sobbing, crying, and Ramakrishna was extreme, crying, rubbing his eyes with his dhoti, like this. Oh, he said, those people are saying such terrible things about me and nobody defends me. Because one needed to learn to stand up for what he believed in, and the other needed to say, what do I care? Complete opposite advice. And it wasn't about humility or pride or anything. It was, who am I? What do I need? What is appropriate? What will move me closer to the center? And that's what real humility is that nothing inside of you prejudices you against perceiving what is right for me to do. And then it's not, none of the other considerations really come into it. What is true? What does God want? And why can't I see it? Too much egoic identification confuses us. Too much faith in what the world thinks. Swami said, most of the people are wrong most of the time. He said, if you ever become famous, keep this in mind. But that's how you have to think about it. What's really important to me? Okay, does that help? Yeah. Okay, the gentleman in front of you also raised his hand in the middle there. Yes. The question is the fact that and actually you're, okay, I don't want to answer it when I'm just trying to summarize it, is that rather than our progress being automatic, we have a conscious awareness of change, and often, very often, fear of the unknown blocks our progress. Okay, so you touched a number of very interesting things. I've been told that the caterpillar actually liquefies. The whole thing is, on one hand, how weird, and on the other hand, how could you not believe in God? Like, who could create such a strange combination of things? You know, the ugly caterpillar, the beautiful butterfly, anyway, yeah. It's like, wow. Okay, but we don't. It would be great if we just spun a cocoon, liquefied, and came out the butterfly. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But there's a progression of self-awareness. And if we start talking metaphysics about reincarnation and the animal level and all of that, the way Yogananda explained it is progress is automatic through the animal stages. And that you manifest, because there's actually, there's a jiva, there's an individuality through those animal stages. All of you have cats and dogs and horses. You know that. There's somebody in there. There's a beautiful dog in the room with us here. There's somebody in there. It's not passive. But the nervous system of animal forms is not sophisticated enough for there also to be conscious self-awareness. And so there's I don't know how, again, it's beyond my pay grade how it works, but you manifest a body that is sufficiently sophisticated to express the extent of consciousness that you have achieved. And Master said that dogs and horses and monkeys are the most sophisticated animal forms. And cat people always get mad when I say it, so I'm quoting on that one, okay? But it's not that the jiva inside a dog body, the body itself allows a more expanded experience of consciousness. And as we expand, much more than a shellfish, attached to a coral reef doesn't have a lot of experiences, whereas the dog that's in the room with us today is living a very human life with human beings. And so they're very advanced by the time they get to be in the company of higher beings. And at a certain point, there's no animal form that is sufficiently sophisticated to express the level of consciousness that the jiva has achieved from all the experiences that it's had. Then you get a human body. And sometimes you see people that you are in human bodies, but just barely, no judgment is involved, but it's self-evident. They're just barely in a human body. And they still have a lot of the intuitive capacities of animals, but it's not self-aware. It's still just because they're this close to that. What happens when you get a human body, and this is how Master also said it, the human nervous system the human body has the capacity to perceive infinity. And this is what puzzles the scientists, is that so much of our brain is not used. But it's there because once you're in a human body, you start on the cycle where you can realize God in the human form because it's sophisticated enough to be able to do it. But what comes with that much self-awareness is choice. In other words, free will. Free will to choose to either move toward the light or not to move toward the light. There's a whole lot of karma that's still pushing you because of those darn vrittis and the chakras. But nonetheless, we have enough self-awareness to choose, to reflect. Because, see, a dog, no matter how sophisticated the dog is, cannot think, gee, I was adopted into this really nice house, but I see that some of my puppy mates were adopted into places where they don't have as much privilege as I do, or I really wanted to live in Italy and here I am stuck in Rochester, New York. You could think that, I could think that, but the dog doesn't have enough self-awareness. But once we have self-awareness, our progress is no longer automatic, and that's exactly what you're saying. Because now we have our own ideas about things. And so we have the opportunity to make whatever choice we want and to have the experience and then to learn from it or not learn from it. And the fear of the unknown. One of the first aphorisms I learned from Swami Kriyananda, the only certainty in life is change. Most people fear change. That's why most people are unhappy. And Swami would say lots of global things that I rebelled against. I just didn't want it to be true. I remember once he made some comment just about how many people in the world are just not happy and their lives really don't work. I said, sir, it's so cynical. He just casually said, oh, you'll see, it's true. And, it is true. Not that we're actually actively suffering, but compared to our potential, we're just not living up to it. We have an opportunity for perfect bliss and we're not living up to it. Because, just exactly what you said. I reduced that to a little phrase, which is most people, this is where it came from. I used to do a lot of counseling in a different phase of my life. And very often a person would come to me, and there are basically two choices in front of them. A black and white situation. I leave this marriage, I stay in it, I take this job, I don't. I take the chemo or I die, whatever it might be. Two choices. But they didn't want either of those two choices. And so the whole counseling session, their whole life was what I called the search for the mythical third alternative. Because we don't want what's in front of us, we're afraid of it. And so, two doors, we have to go through one or the other, but I'm just going to bang my head against this wall and see if it'll turn into a third door. It just isn't there. And we don't want that to be true. So we have a tantrum. Just like the child in the supermarket who throws himself on the floor. I want the bag of cookies, I want the bag of cookies. A friend of mine, her son showed a great disregard. Her son deliberately marked his best shirt with an indelible marking pen. And when she said, "Now you've ruined that shirt," he said, "That's all right, Daddy'll buy me a new one." And she didn't like that. So she took him to Target or Walmart's or someplace like that, and they were going to buy a new shirt. And she brought his piggy bank. So, he has fun. He's picking out a shirt. He's going to pay for it. And he was of an age where money was a matter of volume, not a matter of individual. So she pours out the piggy bank and starts with the pennies. And just right there starts counting out the pennies. And he gradually realizes that most of his piggy bank is going for this shirt. And she was a very brave mom. He threw himself on the floor and started screaming, in the store. And she just keeps counting the piggy bank, until it's empty. But that's what we do. I'm going to lose everything. I don't want to lose everything. And then Divine Mother just keeps doing it. Now, ironically for this, she said it really didn't work. Because afterwards he would say, "I bought this shirt myself." But that, you see how complicated it is? Because we have free will. But what Divine Mother then lets us have is she just lets us have it and waits to see if we learn anything from it. The other side of it is what I also call preference for the known misery. No matter how miserable we are, at least it's familiar. And this is, again, one of those things you just have to practice when it's easier. And you have to really introspect what is really motivating me. Am I really being guided? Am I really being inspired? Or am I letting all those old fritties? Master said, fear is the memory of past suffering and the concern that it's going to come again. And the problem is some of that memory is not in this lifetime, so it's not conscious. It's just anxiety about this. And this is like, the question only is, how's that working for you? Is that serving you? And do I really, is this the apex of my own potential? Or do I have the courage? First attitude on the spiritual path is courage. Courage. That's what Swami writes. That's the first thing you need. And it's courage to trust that where I'm going is where I want to be. Where Divine Mother is taking me is where I want to be. That's why there's so few of us. Really, truthfully. And that's why I do my very best to share with you what I learned and what has worked for me, but I'm not trying to persuade you. Because there's just no way to persuade. But if you think about it, and then you just ask yourself, what do I really want? And what am I willing to do to get it? And why am I so afraid? If Divine Mother is in charge, why do I ever worry about anything? Because change is the only certainty. Do you actually think just by holding on to this it's going to give it to you? I'm going to say something I meant to say way at the beginning. When my father was in that care facility, which was very nice, it was so interesting to me. There were people in there he was in a memory care place, but there were people in there who were really at the end, and nothing was working well anymore. And out of what people thought was a good idea, their rooms were filled with all the pictures of their family and all the things that they'd ever done. And I would think, boy, the Indian system was much better, where you just walk away from all of it and go off into the forest. At a certain point, you just let go of it before it's ripped out of your hands. Is this really such a good idea to keep showing them the album of everything that you've done in this life? I mean, on one hand, yes, might as well start your life review now. Why wait till you die to resolve it? Why not go over it and let go? But to just think that the best way to deal with it is to grip as tightly as I can what's being ripped out of my hands seems odd at best. Yeah, because we're going somewhere else. It's been lovely. One of my friends, when his mother died, she was, she lived on the other side of the country from California. He visited her. He was there with her for a few days. And then she said, now leave. She said, you've been a wonderful son. I've loved having you as my son. it's over, now leave. And he did. And then, you know, he was helping her to let go instead of just, you know, no, I've been at deathbeds, and it's lovely if people are loving you, but it's better if they're blessing you to go, rather than weeping that you're leaving. And so that's what we have to practice all the time. And yes, you've understood it exactly.